Imagine standing on the edge of a vibrating mahogany deck, your heart hammering against your ribs in the suffocating, salt-thick humidity of the South Pacific, watching a $10,000 solution slide silently into the abyss. It is 23:45 on October 19th, 1942, and the waters off Cape Esperance are as black as liquid obsidian. Lieutenant Robert Lynch, just 26 years old, with 14 night patrols and 0 confirmed kills to his name, leans over the wheel of PT-48. He is staring into a velvet darkness that hides a ghost. In the distance, 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges cut through the water, moving 60 elite troops and critical ammunition to reinforce the slaughterhouse of Guadalcanal. Lynch has 4 Mark 8 torpedoes mounted on his boat. These are masterpieces of industrial engineering, each weighing over 2,000 pounds and carrying a 466-pound TNT warhead designed to snap a Japanese destroyer in half. Lynch waits. He bides his time as the silhouettes grow larger. He releases the weapon. He watches the silver bubbling wake streak across the surface, a perfect line aimed straight at the lead barge. But there is no explosion. There is no tower of fire. There is only the silent, mocking ripple of a total miss. The Mark 8 torpedo, the pride of the Bureau of Ordnance, has a minimum depth setting of 10 feet. The Japanese barges, clever and shallow, only draw 5 feet of water. The Navy's most expensive weapon has just passed harmlessly underneath the enemy, heading for the open sea like a massive, sinking paperweight. This is the Torpedo Paradox. The United States possesses the most sophisticated naval technology on Earth, yet it is losing a war of logistics to wooden XXXXXXXXXXXX and thin steel plates. By mid-October, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 has already lost 6 boats in the treacherous waters around the Solomon Islands. 17 sailors are dead, their names added to a ledger of failure that no manual can fix. The pattern is a recurring nightmare. The PT boats detect the Japanese convoys. They attempt their high-stakes torpedo runs. The torpedoes miss because of a simple mathematical error in depth, and the barges respond with a storm of lead. Lynch orders his gunners to open fire with the twin 50-caliber Brownings. The tracers draw jagged orange lines through the night, but as the rounds strike the barges, they don't penetrate. They spark. They ricochet off the quarter-inch steel armor, like hailstones off a tin roof. The 50-caliber round, a beast in the skies of Europe, is a mosquito against the armored skin of a Daihatsu barge. Every night, the Japanese run their supply missions down the slot, a corridor of death that the Americans have dubbed the Tokyo Express. When American aircraft make destroyer runs too dangerous, the Japanese simply switch to these smaller, slower, and nearly invisible barges. They are the invisible bloodline of the Japanese resistance, and Lynch's boat is effectively toothless against them. The squadron commanders at Tulagi are desperate. They are watching their men burn in wooden boats that offer no protection, using weapons that offer no results. Some crews have resorted to mounting single-shot Army M3 37mm anti-tank guns on their bows. They've removed the wheels and lashed the guns to timber planks with rope. It's a desperate, primitive fix. Even Lieutenant John Kennedy on PT-109 tried it. But a single-shot gun that requires a manual reload while Japanese machine guns rake your deck isn't a strategy. It's a suicide pact. The real problem is the overwhelming volume of the enemy. The Japanese are running 30 barges a night past the starving Marines on the island. To stop them, Lynch doesn't need a better torpedo. He needs a tidal wave of explosive force. He needs to break the rules of naval warfare. 3 miles inland, through the dense jungle and the smell of rot, lies Henderson Field. It is a graveyard of broken dreams and shattered duralumin. Japanese bombing raids hit the field almost daily, leaving the runway apron lined with the twisted remains of aircraft that never stood a chance. Among the wreckage lie dozens of Bell P-39 Airacobras. The Airacobra was a strange, controversial fighter. Its engine sat behind the pilot, with a long propeller shaft running directly under the cockpit. This bizarre design was for one purpose: to leave room in the nose for a massive 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon. This wasn't a machine gun. It was a monster that fired through the propeller hub, capable of spitting out 150 high-explosive rounds per minute. Each magazine held 30 rounds that could shred light armor like it was parchment. The Air Force has written these planes off as total losses. Their wings are sheared, their engines are seized, and their fuselages are snapped. But inside those crumpled noses, the M4 cannons are still intact. They are pristine instruments of destruction, waiting for a new home. To the brass in Washington, these are aircraft weapons with no business being on a boat. There is no mounting point. There is no official manual. There is no procurement code. But as Lynch stands on his deck, listening to the Japanese machine guns laugh at his .50 calibers, he realizes that the scrap heaps of Henderson Field hold the only thing that can kill the Tokyo Express. He is about to commit a high-stakes mechanical heist. He is about to strip the firepower from the sky and bolt it to the sea. He finds Technical Sergeant James Coogan, an aircraft armorer who knows every bolt and hydraulic line of the Airacobra, and together they hatch a plan that will either get them court-martialed or turn the tide of the war. They don't have permission. They don't have blueprints. They only have a cutting torch and the absolute necessity to survive. The age of the devil boats is about to begin, and the Japanese barge crews who think they are safe in the shallows are about to learn what happens when a wooden boat starts biting back with the fury of a fighter plane now. October 20th, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The sun is a pale, sickly disk rising over the jagged canopy of the Solomon Islands, but the heat is already a physical weight, a humid blanket that smells of rotting vegetation, oxidized duralumin, and high-octane aviation fuel. Lieutenant Robert Lynch stands at the edge of the runway apron, his boots sinking into the soft, coral-crushed mud that has become a permanent feature of this god-forsaken island. Before him lies the iron jungle. It is a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of mangled wings, snapped fuselages, and scorched rubber, where the wreckage of a dozen air battles has been dragged into heaps to keep the runways clear for the living. This is the final resting place of the Bell P-39 Airacobra, a fighter plane that the Pacific Air War has chewed up and spat out. To the High Command in Washington, these wrecks are merely line items on a loss report, but to Lynch, they represent the only hope for the survival of Squadron 3. He walks past the carcass of a P-400, its tail section sheared off by a Japanese Zero's cannon fire, and stops in front of a shattered Airacobra with its nose buried in the coral. The Airacobra was always a strange bird, a fighter pilot's fever dream and a mechanic's nightmare, designed with its engine sitting behind the pilot and a long propeller shaft running directly under the cockpit. This bizarre architecture was created for one single purpose: to leave the nose of the aircraft wide open for a monster. Protruding from the shattered propeller hub of the dead fighter is a steel finger of absolute destruction, the 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon. Lynch reaches out, his fingers tracing the cold, oil-slicked barrel. He does the math again, the numbers running through his head like a countdown to an execution. 150 high-explosive rounds per minute, each shell a fist of fire, capable of shredding the light armor of a Japanese Daihatsu barge like it was parchment. This wasn't a standard infantry weapon. It was aerial artillery, never meant to see the deck of a boat. There were no requisition forms for what Lynch was about to do. No official doctrine, no procurement code. He was standing in a forbidden garden of ordnance, planning a high-stakes mechanical heist. He needed to strip the firepower from the sky and bolt it to the sea. He finds Technical Sergeant James Coogan leaning against a half-track, his hands stained black with engine grease. Coogan is an aircraft armorer who knows every bolt, every hydraulic line, and every temperamental quirk of the M4 assembly. Lynch doesn't waste time with military formalities. He doesn't need a salute, he needs a thief. He explains the situation, the failing torpedoes, the bouncing 50 calibers, the 17 dead sailors in the squadron. And Coogan looks at the wrecks, then at Lynch, and finally at the distant, shimmering water of the slot. Coogan nods once, his silence a contract of rebellion. By 1400 hours, the graveyard is crawling with sailors carrying cutting torches, heavy wrenches, and timber planks. Lynch has recruited 8 men from his crew, men who are willing to risk a court-martial for unauthorized modification if it means they don't have to watch another mahogany hull burn in the dark. The work is a brutal, high-stakes race against the clock and the Japanese artillery hidden in the ridges. The P-39s are sinking into the mud, and the tropical humidity has turned the nose compartments into steaming ovens of oil and rot. Coogan crawls into the cramped nose of the first wreck, his tools clinking against the duralumin frame. The M4 cannon is mounted to the engine reduction gear, housing with 8 massive high-tensile steel bolts. Each one requires a 15/16-inch socket, but the sailors have had to scavenge and modify their own toolkits, grinding down wrenches to fit into the impossible spaces of the airframe. The bolts have been fused by the violent heat of a crash landing and months of tropical corrosion. Every turn of the wrench is a struggle against the metal itself. They have to disconnect the hydraulic recoil lines, the manual charging cable, the complex ammunition feed chute, and the delicate firing solenoid wiring. The hydraulic fluid has congealed into a thick, black sludge that coats their arms and faces, a greasy reminder of the aircraft's sudden death. When the mounting bolts refuse to move, they have no penetrating oil to speak of. Coogan looks at the fuel tanks of a nearby wreck and makes a choice. They use raw aviation gasoline as a solvent, pouring the high-octane spirit over the seized metal and waiting for the chemical fire to eat through the rust. It is a dangerous, desperate gamble, but on Guadalcanal, safety is a luxury no one can afford. As they work, the air raid sirens begin their mournful, rising wail. Washing Machine Charlie, or a flight of Betty bombers, is on the horizon, signalizing another attempt by the Japanese to sanfang the field. The men don't run for the foxholes. They keep turning the wrenches. They know that if a Japanese shell hits this graveyard now, the fuel-soaked wrecks will become a massive funeral pyre. But the fear of the Tokyo Express is greater than the fear of the bombs. They have 6 hours of daylight to commit this crime. By 1730, they have prying loose 3 complete M4 cannon assemblies. The steel tubes lie on the coral beside the runway, looking like raw silver prizes born from the mud. But the extraction is only the first half of the paradox. Coogan inspects the mechanisms with a professional's eye, his fingers tracing the hairline cracks in a hydraulic recoil cylinder. The first one is awash, a dead weight of shattered metal. The second has a bent feed pole, but Coogan knows he can fix it with a file and 30 minutes of focused labor. The third is a miracle. It is pristine, its internal clockwork still ready to cycle at 150 rounds per minute. Now comes the engineering nightmare that would keep a naval architect awake at night. A P-39 Airacobra moves at 300 miles per hour, its engine and cannon cooled by a massive, freezing slipstream of air. A PT boat at ambush speed is nearly stationary, sitting in the humid, salt-crusted air of the Solomon Sea. The M4 cannon was never meant to fire in a stagnant environment. Without the forced air cooling of flight, the barrel will reach its thermal limit in seconds. Coogan warns Lynch that if Mitchell holds the trigger too long, the metal will reach its plastic state, the rifling will melt, and the gun will become a useless pipe of molten steel. They are building a weapon of absolute discipline. But the deck of PT-48 is only 3/4 of an inch of plywood over oak frames, designed for the vibrations of a .50 caliber machine gun, not the bone-shaking recoil of 37mm shells. They need a mount. They head to the Henderson Field machine shop, a corrugated metal shed with a single lathe and a welding rig powered by a dying diesel generator. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey takes a grease pencil and sketches a design directly onto a sheet of scrap aluminum. It is a crude, industrial pedestal made from salvaged aircraft landing gear and heavy steel base plates. The generator cuts out every 5 minutes because the field is rationing fuel, forcing the welders to work in staccato bursts of orange sparks and deep shadows. They are building a naval gun from the scraps of a fallen air force, welding aircraft parts into a maritime heresy. By 2100 hours, the mount is finished. It is Thokech. Its welds are thick and unground, and the paint is scorched, but it is solid. They heave the 280-pound cannon assembly onto a 6x6 truck, 3 sailors riding in the back to cushion the steel as the truck bounces over the cratered, coral-crushed road down to Lunga Point. The truck reaches the dock at 22:30, where a Higgins boat waits to ferry the illegal cargo across the Iron Bottom Sound to Tulagi. Lynch stands on the bow of PT-48, his heart racing as he watches the crane lower the silver monster onto his deck. His crew has already drilled the mounting holes through the oak framing, a manual, agonizing process with a hand-crank drill that took 2 hours of sweat and muscle. The base plate is bolted down. The cannon is lifted into the yoke. It fits. The mechanism elevates and depresses, its steel barrel pointing toward the dark horizon, where the Daihatsu barges are already moving. They have no quick reload system. They have no ammunition bay. They simply stack 6 horseshoe-shaped magazines, each weighing 40 pounds, directly onto the wooden deck beside the gun mount. Mitchell, the gunner, sits behind the weapon on a wooden ammunition box, his hands feeling the unfamiliar contours of the aircraft trigger. They have no time for test firing. They have no time for training. The Tokyo Express doesn't wait for bureaucracy, and the Green Dragons are done fighting with toothless torpedoes. The Stinger has been born from the P-Lu of the jungle, and as Lynch orders the engines to start, the low, powerful rumble of the Packards signals the beginning of a new kind of war. They are heading into the dark, carrying a fighter plane's fire into the shallow reaches of the Solomons, and as the wake begin to trail behind them, everyone on board knows that the rules of naval combat have just been rewritten in the grease and the sparks of Henderson Field. The heist is complete, but the survival of PT-48 now rests on a weapon that officially doesn't exist, and a crew that refused to die by the book now. The midnight air inside the Henderson Field machine shop is a suffocating cocktail of ozone, burnt oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of an arc welder's strobe, a sensory assault that defines the desperate reality of the Solomon Islands in 1942. Outside, the jungle is a wall of wet heat and screaming insects, a prehistoric darkness that feels as though it is trying to reclaim the runway. But inside this corrugated metal cathedral, the laws of naval architecture are being dismantled and rewritten by hand in the dirt. Chief Machinist's Mate, Donald Frey, stands over a sheet of scrap aluminum, his eyes narrowed and bloodshot from lack of sleep, as he grips a grease pencil with fingers stained deep with the black, indelible grime of engine work. He is not just drawing a gun mount, he is translating a desperate, lethal necessity into a physical anchor that must survive the impossible. Beside him, Technical Sergeant James Coogan stares at the Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon, a 280-pound silver Predator that was never meant to leave the nose of a fighter plane. This is the birth of the Franken mount, a mechanical heresy and a scrap heap rebellion against the failure of institutional doctrine. The problem facing these men is a brutal, unforgiving calculation of kinetic energy versus structural integrity. The ANM-4 was designed to be integrated into the rigid, armored steel skeleton of a Bell P-39 Cobra, where the massive weight of the Allison engine and the rigid airframe could absorb the violent, bone-shaking recoil of 37mm high-explosive shells. But PT-48 is a different breed of animal entirely. She is a creature of Honduran mahogany and plywood, an 80-foot shell of light timber, designed for the high-speed planing of a torpedo run, not for the heavy, rhythmic thumping of aerial artillery. Frey looks at the bow deck of the boat, only 3/4 of an inch of plywood over oak stringers, and he knows that the first time Harold Mitchell pulls that trigger, the recoil forces will act like a massive, high-velocity sledgehammer hitting a glass table. If the mount isn't perfect, if the distribution of force is even slightly off-center, the cannon won't just miss the target. It will rip itself through the deck, shattering the oak frames and potentially sinking the boat from the inside out in the middle of a gunfight. Frey's design is a masterclass in battlefield improvisation, a marriage of aeronautical debris and maritime grit. He needs a pedestal that is both a massive shock absorber and a precision-rotating turret. He scavenges the salvage yard for the third time tonight, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick tropical mist to find the heavy steel struts of a destroyed B-17 landing gear. This is high-grade alloy steel, built to survive the impact of a 30,000-pound bomber hitting a coral runway at 100 miles per hour. And it is exactly what he needs for the vertical column of the mount. He begins to weld, the orange sparks cascading over his oil-soaked boots as the diesel generator groans and flickers, threatening to die under the immense load of the arc. He is building a 12-inch steel base plate, a massive anchor that will distribute the cannon's violent energy across 4 separate oak deck frames, ensuring the wood can flex without splintering. But there is another problem that Coogan is obsessed with: the cooling paradox. In the sky, at 10,000 feet, the M4 cannon is bathed in a freezing 300-mile-per-hour slipstream that sucks the heat away from the thin-walled aircraft barrel as fast as it can be generated by the rapid-fire explosions. But on the water, lurking in the humid, stagnant shadows of the Solomon Sea, there is no wind. There is only the salt-crusted, heavy air. Coogan knows that at 150 rounds per minute, the 37mm barrel will reach its thermal plastic state in a matter of seconds. He warns the crew that they are building a weapon of absolute discipline. If they spray and pray, the rifling will melt into a smooth, useless tube of molten steel before the first magazine is even empty. They are building a weapon that requires a marksman's soul and a mechanic's touch to survive the heat of its own fury. Throughout the night, the shop is a symphony of industrial struggle and mechanical defiance. The lathe, a prehistoric piece of equipment that should have been scrapped before the Great Depression, screams as it turns a rotating collar from a piece of scavenged heavy-duty steel fuel pipe. Frey doesn't have proper ball bearings. Those are a luxury the Solomons can't afford. So he improvises with the genius of a man who has nothing left to lose, machining bronze bushings salvaged from damaged aircraft wheel assemblies. He polishes the surfaces with oil and grit until they are as smooth as glass, hoping that the bronze will survive the friction of the gun's recoil without seizing in the heat of combat. Every weld is a gamble against the dark. Every bolt is a prayer for survival. They are working in 5-minute intervals, letting the generator cool down before striking the arc again, their faces illuminated by the eerie, ultraviolet glow of the welder's torch, looking like ghosts in a metalworking purgatory. By 0100 hours, the pedestal begins to look like a true weapon of war. It is thokek, its welds are thick and unground, and the paint is a mismatched coat of zinc chromate primer and naval gray. But it is solid. As they heave the assembly onto the deck of PT-48, the true test of the Franken mount begins in the pre-dawn shadows. Lynch's crew has to integrate this aerial predator into the boat's mahogany nervous system. They are drilling into the bow deck with a hand-cranked drill, the sailors taking turns until their shoulders ache and their palms bleed from the repetitive grinding motion. They are doubling up the oak frames underneath, bolting heavy timber backing plates to ensure the plywood doesn't splinter under the first mag of 37mm thunder. Coogan is focused on the ammunition feed, the heart of the beast. The M4 uses a unique horseshoe-shaped magazine that holds 30 rounds of high-explosive shells. Each magazine weighs 40 pounds when loaded, a heavy, awkward crescent of steel that was meant to be handled by an automatic feeder in a fighter's nose. On the deck of a rolling, pitching PT boat in the middle of the slot, there is no automatic feeder. There is only a loader standing in the salt spray, hand-feeding these massive magazines, while the gun gam thet and the boat leaps over the waves at 40 knots. They fabricate a set of crude steel racks to hold the spare magazines, lashing them to the deck beside the mount with heavy rope and waterproof canvas. As the first hint of grey light touches the horizon over Iron Bottom Sound, the installation is finally complete. The silver barrel of the Oldsmobile cannon points toward the sea, a raw industrial intruder on the wooden bow of the PT boat. It rotates, not with the smooth precision of a factory turret, but with a gritty, determined resistance that tells you it was built in the dirt by men who refused to be outgunned. Mitchell sits in the gunner's seat, his hands on the unfamiliar grips, feeling the weight and the kinetic potential of the machine. They haven't fired a single test shot. They don't know if the mount will hold, or if the plywood will shatter into toothpicks, or if the barrel will melt after 10 rounds of high-explosive fire. But they do know that the Tokyo Express is coming back tonight, and they are done fighting with toothless torpedoes and bouncing 50 calibers that do nothing but signal their position to the enemy. The Franken mount is a testament to the fact that when the military-industrial complex fails the soldier, the men on the ground will fix it with their own hands and the scraps of a fallen air force. It is a weapon born of scrap steel, stolen parts, and pure, concentrated adrenaline. A mechanical middle finger to the Bureau of Ordnance, and every officer who said it couldn't be done. As Lynch orders the engines to cough into life, the low, powerful rumble of the Packards vibrates through the new mount, as if the boat itself is welcoming its new teeth. They are heading into the dark, carrying a fighter plane's fire into the shallow reaches of the Solomons, and as the wake begins to trail behind them, everyone on board PT-48 knows that the rules of naval combat have just been rewritten in the grease and the sparks of Henderson Field. The machinist and the armorer have given the sea its dragon, and as the salt spray hits the hot steel of the cannon, the countdown to Cape Esperance begins in earnest. This is the moment where improvisation becomes legend. and where the scrap heaps of the jungle prove more valuable than the gold of the treasury. Every weld is holding, every bolt is tight, and for the first time in 14 patrols, Robert Lynch has the power to strike through the steel of the enemy and reclaim the waters of the slot. The Franken mount is ready, Mitchell is ready, and the Japanese barges are about to discover that the wooden boats they once laughed at have just grown a bite that can tear their world apart, round by round. The silence of the night is about to be shattered by the rhythmic thunder of 37mm shells, and the history of the South Pacific will forever remember the night the Air Force went to sea. In the humid darkness, the silver barrel reflects the starlight, a cold promise of the carnage to come. They move forward into the obsidian void, the three Packards humming a low mechanical prayer for the success of the weapon they built in the dark. And as the radar screen flickers to life, the time for building is over and the time for killing has arrived. The weight of the 37mm shells clinking in the horseshoe magazines is a new sound for the boat, a heavy, brassy resonance that replaces the lighter rattle of 50 caliber belts. Each loader on the deck knows his role, practicing the slam and lock of the heavy magazines in the dark, feeling for the release catch with sweat-slicked fingers. Kugan stands beside the mount, one hand on the recoil cylinder, checking for leaks in the hydraulic lines they salvaged from the P-39. He knows that if a seal fails, the gun will become a 280-pound unguided missile on the deck. He has used every scrap of rubber and gasket material he could find, sealing the connections with the desperation of a man whose life depends on a tight fit. Frey watches from the dock as the boat pulls away, his welding goggles still pushed up on his forehead, his face a mask of exhaustion and pride. He has seen many things built in this war, but nothing as raw and as vital as the Franken mount. He knows that the institutional navy will eventually catch up, that factory-made mounts will arrive with proper serial numbers and polished bearing surfaces, but they will never have the soul of this one. This mount was built from the bones of planes that fell defending this island, and it carries the spirit of every pilot who died in the iron jungle. As the PT boat disappears into the mist of Iron Bottom Sound, the sound of the engines fades to a low hum, leaving the machine shop in a sudden, heavy silence. The arc welder is cold, the lathe is still, and the grease pencil sketch on the aluminum sheet is the only record of the mechanical rebellion that just went to war. The sailors on the boat are no longer just patrolmen. They are the architects of a new tactical reality, and as they prepare their first magazine, they are the undisputed masters of the 37mm Stinger now. The night of October 21st, 1942, at Cape Esperance, is a suffocating velvet void of absolute blackness, where the stars are swallowed by a thick, tropical overcast, and the only truth is the low, muffled, rhythmic thrum of the three Packard engines vibrating through the mahogany hull of PT-48. Lieutenant Robert Lynch stands in the armored cockpit, his knuckles white as he grips the wooden wheel, his eyes staring into the obsidian dark with the intensity of a man who has learned to see the invisible ripples of the Solomon Sea. Beside him, Gunner Harold Mitchell sits perched behind the Franken mount on the bow, his hands resting on the cold, oil-slicked steel of the 37mm Oldsmobile aircraft cannon, his thumb hovering near the trigger like a predator waiting for the kill. This is the moment where theory meets the metal, where the scrap heap engineering and the midnight welding of Henderson Field are about to be tested against the steel and the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They are running on only 2 engines at 15 knots, keeping the wake small and the noise even lower, lurking like a wooden ghost in the shadows of the jagged volcanic cliffs. At 23:55, the radar operator's voice crackles through the internal headset like a serrated knife. Surface contacts, bearing 320 4,000 yards. 4 ghosts are moving down the slot at 8 knots. Lynch doesn't hesitate. He signals the engineer to kick in the center engine, and the boat surges forward with a violent low-frequency growl, the bow rising out of the water as the 3,500 horsepower engines roar into a full-throated symphony of war. These are not destroyers. These are the Daihatsu barges, the armored, shallow-draft bloodline of the Japanese resistance that have turned the American torpedoes into expensive, sinking junk. But tonight, the rules of the Solomons have been rewritten in grease and stolen parts. Lynch closes the distance with a cold, predatory focus, ignoring the standard naval doctrine that dictates he should stay at 1,000 yards for safety. He knows that at 1,000 yards, he is just a target. He needs to be close enough to see the rivets on their armor and the terror in their eyes. At 3,000 yards, the silhouettes become sharp. 4 Type A barges in a tight, disciplined line formation. Their decks crowded with the dark, huddled shapes of 60 elite Japanese infantrymen and the lethal, spiked silhouettes of Type 92 heavy machine guns. Mitchell feels the weight of the gun as he manually cycles the heavy charging handle. The mechanical, metallic clatter of the first 37mm round seating into the chamber, sounding like the hammer of a god being cocked in the silence. "Gun ready," Mitchell whispers to himself, his breath hitching as the salt spray hits his face. At 1,500 yards, the lead Japanese barge detects the wooden intruder. An orange flare arcs into the night sky, illuminating the black water in a sickly, flickering light. And then, the world erupts. The Japanese machine guns open fire, their tracers drawing jagged, glowing orange lines across the obsidian water. The 7.7mm rounds stitching the surf just 30 yards short of the boat's mahogany bow. Lynch doesn't flinch. He holds the course, closing the gap to 800 yards, the absolute point of no return. "Open fire!" Lynch screams into the wind, and Mitchell pulls the trigger. The response is a physical explosion of light and raw mechanical sound. The 37mm Oldsmobile cannon doesn't just fire. It roars with a high-pitched rhythmic howl that completely dwarfs the thunder of the engines. The muzzle flash is a blinding ultraviolet strobe that illuminates the entire bow deck in a ghostly white light, turning the mahogany into silver and casting long, flickering shadows of the crew against the ocean spray. The recoil is a violent, bone-shaking force that drives the gun backward in its mount, the kinetic energy traveling through the pedestal and into the oak deck frames, with the power of a pneumatic hammer hitting a resonant drum. The plywood deck flexes, the mahogany stringers groan under the stress, but the Franken mount, built from aircraft landing gear, holds firm. The gun cycles at 150 rounds per minute, 2.5 explosive shells every single second, each one a fist of fire carrying the fury of a fighter plane. Mitchell keeps his finger on the trigger. The tracers are a solid, unbroken beam of white-hot energy, punching across the dark and slamming into the lead barge along its waterline with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. There is no spark, no ricochet, no hailstone effect. The high-explosive 37mm rounds punch through the quarter-inch steel armor like it is wet cardboard, detonating inside the troop compartment with a series of rhythmic, devastating thuds that send shards of metal and wood into the air. The first 3 rounds shred the hull. The 4th round finds the diesel fuel tank. An orange pillar of fire, 50 feet high, erupts from the center of the barge, throwing the jagged shadows of screaming men against the billowing black smoke. The barge doesn't just stop, It disintegrates. Mitchell yanks the empty horseshoe magazine off the mount, the feed mechanism coming away hot and smoking, the smell of burnt cordite and vaporizing hydraulic fluid filling his lungs. He grabs the second 40-pound magazine, slamming it home with a grunt of pure, primal adrenaline, the reload process taking only 8 seconds, an eternity in a gunfight, but a miracle for a weapon that officially shouldn't exist. The second barge in the formation tries to turn hard to port, its diesel engine screaming in a desperate attempt to brake for the shallow coral reefs, but Lynch is already on it. He brings PT-48 around in a tight, leaning turn, the hull skipping over the waves at 45 knots, the spray flying over the gunwale. At 600 yards, Mitchell opens fire again. The second magazine is a masterpiece of tactical destruction. 22 rounds hit the target in a single, sustained burst. The first 5 shells satisfy the armor plate, but the 6th shell finds the ammunition stores stacked amidships. The resulting explosion is a blinding white sun that rises out of the Solomon Sea. A blast so powerful it sends a physical shockwave across the water that rattles the teeth of the American sailors and blows the windows out of the chart house. The barge is simply gone, not burned, not sunk, but evaporated into a cloud of splinters and black smoke. The remaining 2 Japanese barges scatter like roaches caught in a flashlight beam, one heading north toward the treacherous rocks of Savo Island, and the other making a desperate run for the safety of the Guadalcanal shoreline. Lynch pursues the southern target, the boat leaping through the thick, oily smoke of the previous kills. Mitchell reaches for the third magazine, but he feels the mount's rotating collar binding, the bronze bushings expanding from the localized heat of 90 rounds of high-velocity fire. He has to muscle the gun, his shoulders and back straining against the heavy steel as he tracks the fleeing target through the spray. The Japanese machine gunner on the third barge is desperate. His Type 92 machine gun, spitting 7.7mm rounds that stitch the mahogany bow of PT-48, one round punching a jagged hole through the plywood deck just 18 inches from Mitchell's boot. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't stop. He pulls the trigger, and the 37mm shells walk up the barge from stern to bow, shattering the diesel engine and shredding the troop deck with horrific efficiency. The barge's engine dies with a final, choked cough, and the vessel begins to drift helplessly in the dark as the survivors scramble over the side into the water. Lynch looks at the glowing dials on the dashboard. 0020 hours. In 25 minutes of combat, they have done what an entire squadron of torpedo boats couldn't accomplish in 3 months of patrolling. Mitchell has fired 90 rounds of aircraft-grade artillery. The gun is still radiating a fierce heat, the scent of vaporizing oil and salt water thick on the air. But the Franken mount stands tall and victorious. The deck didn't collapse into the bilge. The plywood didn't shatter. The illegal modification, born in the mud of Henderson Field and the sparks of a midnight workshop, has just rewritten the naval history of the Pacific Theater. Lynch reaches for the radio handset, his voice steady, but carried by the immense weight of a monumental victory. Tulagi, this is 48. The salvaged aircraft cannon worked. Repeat, it worked better than anyone ever expected. 3 barges accounted for. No casualties on our end. We are coming home. As PT-48 turns its bow back toward the safety of the base, the white wake trailing behind them glows in the starlight. The silhouette of the boat, Geojai, Sohu, the lethal, jagged profile of a dragon. The Japanese survivors drifting in the water will tell stories of a wooden boat with the high-speed sting of a fighter plane, a demon boat that spits explosive fire from its nose. The era of the barge busters has officially begun, and the Tokyo Express is no longer the undisputed master of the Solomon Shallows. Every Marine on Guadalcanal and every sailor in Squadron 3 will soon know the name Robert Lynch and the legend of the gun that came from the sky to save the sea. This was not just a battle. It was a revolution of the frontline soldier against the constraints of a failing doctrine, a testament to the fact that ingenuity is the greatest weapon in the American arsenal. Mitchell sits down, his hands shaking as the adrenaline recedes, looking at the silver barrel that won the night. They have survived. They have adapted. And tomorrow, they will go back to the iron jungle to build another one. The mahogany is still wet with the ocean, the engines are cooling, and for the first time in 14 nights, there is the taste of a clean victory on the wind. The silence that follows is not one of fear, but one of earned respect. They move through the dark, the 3 Packards humming a low mechanical prayer, carrying the spirit of Henderson Field back to Tulagi. Lynch watches the radar, the screen now clear of ghosts, knowing that the rules of the sea have forever changed. The night is no longer the ally of the shallow barge, for the devil boats have learned to hunt. Mitchell leans against the pedestal, the metal still warm beneath his touch. A silent bond forged between the man, the wood, and the salvaged steel. The first victory of the Franken Mount is complete, and the Pacific is a little bit safer for those who dare to innovate in the face of death now. The echoes of the 25-minute slaughter at Cape Esperance had barely faded into the humid morning air of October 22, 1942, before the legendary status of PT-48 reached every corner of the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Robert Lynch's return to the Tulagi docks wasn't just a routine mission report. It was a total tactical paradigm shift that sent a shockwave through Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. For months, the crews had lived in a state of growing resentment, frustrated by torpedoes that were too sophisticated to hit a shallow wooden barge and machine guns that were too light to do anything but spark off Japanese steel. But as the sailors crowded around the bow of 48, staring at the scorched paint and the heavy industrial frame of the 37mm Oldsmobile cannon, they didn't see a field modification anymore. They saw the end of the Tokyo Express. By noon, every boat commander in the squadron was demanding a monster gun for his own deck, and the informal heist at Henderson Field suddenly transformed into a full-scale, systematic salvage operation. On October 23rd, the mission became industrial. Lynch, Coogan, and a team from PT-40, 46, and 60 descended upon the iron jungle with a level of focus that only combat desperation can forge. The mechanics at Henderson Field, led by Technical Sergeant James Coogan, had turned the extraction of the M4 cannon into a high-stakes science. The first salvage job had taken nearly 3 hours of wrestling with seized bolts and congealed hydraulic fluid. But by the time they reached the 4th wreck, they had the process down to a brutal 55 minutes. They knew exactly which 15/16" bolts were the load bearers, which hydraulic recoil lines to sever with a single strike, and where to place the cutting torch to bypass the engine reduction gear housing. They were stripped to the waist, their skin slick with the black grease of dead Aerocobras and the stinging sweat of the tropics, working under the constant threat of Japanese artillery fire from the hills. While Coogan's team stripped the sky, Chief Machinist Donald Frey was back at the machine shop, refining the design of the Franken Mount. He had seen the scoring on 48's rotating collar after just 90 rounds of combat. The high-velocity recoil having ground the steel-bearing surfaces into a jagged mess. Frey knew that for the cannon to survive a campaign, it needed more than just scrap steel. It needed lubrication and friction management. He scavenged the aircraft wheel assemblies from a pile of destroyed B-17 parts, extracting high-grade bronze bushings that were designed to handle the immense landing forces of a heavy bomber. He machined these bushings into the pedestals, creating a second generation of mounts that rotated with a smooth, deadly precision. He added heavy-duty steel backing plates beneath the plywood decks, sandwiches of metal and oak that turned the flexible bow of an Elco boat into a rigid platform for artillery. But as the guns began to populate the bows of the squadron, a new bottleneck emerged that threatened to silence the revolution before it truly began. The logistics of the horseshoe magazine. The M4 cannon was an aerial weapon designed for engagements that lasted seconds, but on the water, the hunt for barges was a marathon of suppression and direct fire. Each horseshoe magazine held 30 rounds of 37mm shells and weighed nearly 40 pounds when fully loaded. The Air Force Armory at Henderson Field was suddenly under siege by Navy boat crews asking for ammunition loads that the Airacobras wouldn't fire in a month. Every single round had to be hand-loaded into the magazines, a grueling process of checking the seating depth and ensuring the horseshoe feed pawls were perfectly aligned. The aviation ordnance personnel at Henderson established a specialized bay, running 4 loaders on 12-hour shifts. They became the hidden heart of the barge-busting campaign, hand-filling 40 magazines a day, their thumbs bruised and their muscles aching from the repetitive grind. Each PT boat was now going out with 6 magazines, 180 rounds of high-explosive thunder, which sounds like plenty until you realize that at 150 rounds per minute, a boat could go from a gunboat to a wooden target in just 72 seconds of sustained fire. This scarcity forced a rapid evolution in tactical doctrine. The boat commanders learned to attack in pairs, a strategy that the Japanese soon learned to fear above all others. One boat, equipped with a 37mm cannon, would act as the executioner, closing to within 400 yards, point-blank range for the Oldsmobile gun, where the high-explosive rounds could punch through the quarter-inch steel armor of a Daihatsu barge and detonate inside the troop compartment with 100% hit probability. The second boat, still armed with the standard twin 50-caliber turrets, would provide a wall of suppressive fire, keeping the Japanese Type 92 machine gunners pinned down and blinded while the cannon did its grisly work. The results were staggering. In the final week of October, the stats told the story that the brass in Washington couldn't ignore. 23 Japanese barges engaged, 14 destroyed, 6 damaged, and most importantly, 0 PT boats lost. The Devil boats were no longer a rumor. They were the primary threat to the Japanese bloodline. Radio intercepts from October 25th revealed the psychological impact on the Japanese barge crews, who were now reporting demon boats with aircraft guns that could vaporize a squad of men before they could even return fire. The fear was so intense that some Japanese crews began abandoning their barges at the first sight of a PT boat's wake, preferring the shark-infested waters to the explosive fire of the 37mm shells. As the success of the field modification reached the higher commands, Commander Alan Calvert sent a confidential dispatch to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. He included technical drawings of Frey's pedestal mount, Coogan's maintenance logs, and a brutal, honest assessment of the combat results. To the credit of the Bureau, the usual bureaucratic molasses was bypassed by the sheer volume of Japanese wreckage in Iron Bottom Sound. On December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy officially authorized the production of standardized pedestal mounts for M4 cannons on all PT boats. But the war wouldn't wait for a factory in Rhode Island. When Squadron 6 arrived in mid-December, with fresh crews and standard torpedoes, they were horrified to find that the old hands of Squadron 3 were effectively fighting a different war. Squadron 6's commander immediately demanded cannons for his boats, But Henderson Field was empty. Every wrecked Airacobra had been picked clean of its nose artillery. The solution came from a creative, borderline illegal requisition in New Caledonia. A cargo ship carrying factory-fresh M4 replacement guns for the 13th Air Force was diverted. Through a series of paperwork errors that were never fully investigated, 12 brand-new cannons were loaded onto a Catalina flying boat and flown directly to Tulagi. These weren't salvaged wrecks caked in coral dust. They were pristine, factory-fresh instruments of war, still packed in their protective cosmoline grease. The difference in performance was immediate. The new guns cycled with a mechanical perfection that the salvaged versions couldn't match, and the rate of fire was so reliable that the boat commanders began to push the limits of their vessels even further. By January 1943, the PT boat had officially transformed. It was no longer a torpedo boat that occasionally used machine guns. It was a heavily armed gunboat that carried torpedoes as secondary weapons. The culmination of this evolution was the birth of the M9 cannon. The Bureau of Ordnance, recognizing that the M4 was still an aircraft gun, ill-suited for the saltwater environment, commissioned Colt in Hartford, Connecticut, to build a purpose-built naval variant. The M9 was nearly double the weight of the aircraft version, with a longer 78-inch barrel that pushed the muzzle velocity to a staggering 3,000 feet per second. This was the final nail in the coffin for the Japanese barge traffic. The increased velocity meant a flatter trajectory and a lethal effective range of 1,000 yards, allowing the PT boats to destroy their targets before the Japanese machine guns could even reach them. The field modification from a scrap heap at Henderson Field had taken 18 months to become official factory doctrine, moving from salvaged aircraft parts to a standardized naval weapon system that would eventually be mounted on over 500 boats across the Pacific and the Mediterranean. As the sun set over the Solomons in early 1943, the Green Dragons stood ready with their new, factory-engineered teeth. They had proven that in the crucible of combat, the most effective weapon isn't the one designed in a laboratory by engineers in white coats. It's the one forged in the mud and the grease by sailors who refused to accept the math of failure. They were no longer the underdogs. They were the masters of the shallows, carrying the spirit of Henderson Field into every engagement, proving that the American tradition of improvisation was the most lethal force in the Pacific theater. With the M9 now arriving in crates, the era of salvaged wreckage was closing, but the legend of the Franken Mount would forever remain the spark that turned the tide of the coastal war. They had taken the sky and bolted it to the sea, and in doing so, they had ensured that the Tokyo Express would never reach its destination now. August 15th, 1945. The shadow of the rising sun finally retreats from the Pacific, and as the radio wires hum with the news of the Japanese surrender, a sudden heavy silence falls over the Solomon Islands that hasn't been heard in nearly 4 years. For the men of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, the victory is measured not just in territory gained, but in a brutal, definitive ledger of statistics that rewrite the history of coastal warfare. The legacy of the 37mm cannon, a weapon born in the mud and the grease of Henderson Field, is now etched into the official after-action reports of the United States Navy as the most successful field modification of the war. The numbers are staggering and undeniable. Before Lieutenant Robert Lynch and his crew scavenged that first aircraft gun from a wrecked Airacobra, PT boats were averaging a mere 0.3 kills per patrol, their high-tech torpedoes proving to be expensive, deep-diving failures against the shallow Japanese barges. But after the installation of the 37mm monster gun, that kill rate skyrocketed to 1.8 vessels per patrol. 6 times more effective, 6 times more lethal, and the cost of that success, the most precious currency of the conflict, was paid in the lives of American sailors. In the dark, desperate days of 1942, the casualty rate for PT boat crews in the Solomons was a staggering 4.2 sailors per week. After the 37mm cannon gave them the ability to destroy the enemy from a distance, that number plummeted to 1.7. A 60% reduction in American blood spilled. The field modification didn't just win battles, it brought sons, fathers, and brothers home. 800 Japanese vessels, barges, freighters, and sub-chasers now lay at the bottom of the Pacific, victims of a weapon that officially shouldn't have existed. That is 48,000 Japanese troops who never reached the front lines. That is 6,000 tons of ammunition and food that never found its mark. The Tokyo Express wasn't just derailed. It was vaporized by the ingenuity of a few sailors who refused to accept the math of failure. But as the war ends, the fate of the devil boats takes a melancholic and tragic turn. Of the 531 PT boats that served in World War II, nearly all were equipped with the 37mm cannon by 1945. Yet today, the fleet is a ghost. In the weeks following the surrender, the Navy, faced with the staggering logistics of bringing thousands of wooden boats home, made a cold, final decision. They moved the PT boats to remote beaches, stripped them of their engines and their legendary cannons, and set them on fire. Thousands of mahogany hulls, the same ones that carried the barge busters through the darkest nights of the Solomons, burned in massive funeral pyres that lit up the Pacific sky for days. It was a brutal end for the Green Dragons, a final act of bureaucratic efficiency that turned legendary vessels into drifting ash. The men who made it happen returned to a world that was already moving on. Lieutenant Robert Lynch, the man who looked at a pile of scrap and saw a revolution, went back to Philadelphia. He earned the Navy Cross for his bravery at Cape Esperance, but he spent the rest of his life as a quiet electrical engineer, rarely speaking of the night he turned a fighter plane into a naval predator. He died in 1978, a hero who sought no spotlight. Technical Sergeant James Coogan, the aircraft armorer who knew every bolt of the Airacobra, remained in the service, eventually retiring as a master sergeant in 1962. He left behind a collection of maintenance logs that are now preserved in the National Archives, the only physical evidence of the hundreds of cannons he saved from the mud. Chief Machinist Donald Frey, the unsung genius who designed the Franken mount with a grease pencil on a sheet of scrap aluminum, returned to Washington State to work in the shipyards. He received no medals for his mechanical rebellion, no commendations for his bronze bushings or his welded pedestals. He died in 1991, his contribution to the war hidden in the technical specifications of factory-built mounts that were produced 18 months too late to save his friends. Harold Mitchell, the first man to fire that aircraft gun in anger from a wooden deck, taught the secrets of the Stinger to dozens of crews, including the men of PT 109. He lived to see the turn of the century, passing away in 2006, a final witness to the era of the demon boats. Today, if you travel to Fall River, Massachusetts, you can stand on the deck of PT 617. There, on the bow, sits the 37mm M9 cannon, a factory-standard descendant of the improvised monster built at Henderson Field. It is a sleek, powerful instrument of war, but if you look closely at the mount, you can see the DNA of Frey's original design. You can see the legacy of the sailors who didn't wait for permission, who didn't wait for a design review or a safety analysis. They saw a tactical problem, and they solved it with the tools they had in their hands. The 37mm Revolution remains the most successful field-modified weapon in the history of the United States Navy. It is a testament to the fact that when the stakes are life and death, the most powerful weapon isn't the one designed in a laboratory by engineers in white coats. It is the one born of desperation, salvage, and the can-do spirit of the American sailor. The Japanese called them devil boats, not because of their technology, but because of the spirit of the men who manned them, men who could take a crashed fighter and make it scream across the waves. As we look at the silent barrels of the survivors in the museums, we must remember that the true strength of the Navy wasn't the mahogany or the steel. It was the ingenuity of the men who refused to be outgunned. They turned the sky into the sea, and in doing so, they ensured that the Tokyo Express would never reach its destination. They were the barge busters, the mechanical outlaws, and the defenders of the slot. And their story remains a beacon of what is possible when grit meets imagination in the face of absolute darkness now.